Good day, everyone. My name is Catherine Au, and I'm an Environmental Review Specialist at ICF. I'm joined today by my colleague Sandy Fry at ICF, Danielle Shoup at HUD's Office of Native American Programs, and Kathy McNulty at HUD's Office of Environment and Energy. It's great to see that we have a full house today with a lot of familiar names and also several HUD reps from around the country. So today's webinar is going to be about aggregation of projects for environmental reviews under 24 CFR, Part 5832. This webinar is the second in a webinar series on environmental reviews sponsored by the Office of Native American Programs. Last month, we had a webinar going over the basic environmental review forms, including how to write project descriptions, levels of review, and other components of the different types of environmental review forms. You can check HUD's website for the recording and materials, which should be up in about a month or so, as well as today's webinar. And today's topic is aggregation. Later on in the fall, there will be a webinar on emergency repair programs and reevaluation of completed environmental reviews. So stay tuned for those in the future. Today's objectives are to discuss aggregation. We'll start off with what the HUD regulations say about aggregation, and then apply that knowledge or those requirements to tribal housing programs, including by levels of review, including exempt activities, non-physical activities, rehab and maintenance activities for low rent units, your various acquisition and rehab, new construction projects, and those components. So we'll go over many different examples and have poll questions to check your understanding of what we're going over. And feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and I'll take breaks every couple of slides and check and see if you have any questions or comments. Okay, so what is aggregation? The text in the regulation at 24 CFR 5832 has 4 sections talking about aggregation, the requirement, different types of aggregation, why you aggregate, and the several different caveats and nuances. So the first one, A, talks about the requirement, which is a responsible entity, and in your case, that's going to be the tribe. So the tribe must group together and evaluate as a single project all individual activities that are related either on a geographical or functional basis, or are logical parts of a composite of contemplated actions. So that was a mouthful, very confusing sentence. You might not understand what that says the first time you read that. So let me break that down. Basically, you want to group together related activities, and activities can be related geographically, functionally, or logically, and then evaluate those activities as a single project under one environmental review. Take a step back for a moment. What is a project? In the HUD regulations, a project means an activity or group of related activities designed by the recipient to accomplish a specific objective. So for example, if your objective is to increase regional affordable home ownership opportunities, maybe you have a lease purchase program where you're either acquiring existing units or building new construction and then rehabbing and maintaining those units and eventually dispossessing those units and changing ownership of that. So all of those activities under the lease purchase program, that would be one project for the environmental review. Another example, maybe your objective is to increase the stock of available housing opportunities in one community. And maybe you're building a new subdivision, and that entails constructing new housing units and building out infrastructure. That new subdivision and all the components of it would be one project. All right, so back to the regulations under B, the different types of aggregation. We have functional versus geographic, or a combination of both. And functional aggregation is when a specific type of activity takes place in several locations, whereas geographic aggregation is when a mix of dissimilar but related activities is concentrated in a fairly specific project area. And then you have a combination of approaches where you might have a project that actually has both functional and geographic aggregation. And then C talks about why aggregate. The purpose is to adequately address and analyze in one review the separate and combined impacts of activities that are similar, connected, and closely related, or that are dependent on other activities and actions. When you say similar, that's getting at functional aggregation. Connected, that's geographic. And then dependent on other activities and actions, that gets at logical aggregation. And then once you combine all of those, then you're able to, once you have a full scope of a project, then you're able to consider the reasonable alternative courses of action, schedule the activities to resolve conflicts or mitigate the individual or combined effects of your project on the environment or the health and safety of the occupants, and prescribe mitigation measures and safeguards, including alternatives and modifications. To do this adequately and understand what the full impacts of your project are to the environment and to health and safety of the community, you have to have a full scope of the project. So you can't just have a narrowly defined project component and say that's where the funding is going and that's what the project is going to be. You have to look at the big picture of what is the full project in order to understand the full environmental impacts and be able to plan accordingly. And then finally, the citation at 5832 Tdhes talks about multi-year project aggregation and release of funds. When you have a project that takes place over 2 or more years, your environmental review should consider the relationship among all component activities, regardless of the source of funds, and address and evaluate their cumulative environmental effects. And then the estimated range of the activities and the estimated cost of the total project must be listed and described by the tribe in the environmental review and included in the request for release of funds. Very important, the release of funds covers the entire project period, with the caveat or nuance that if more than 5 years has gone by since you completed the environmental review and got your release of funds, and then 5 years or more later, you finally break ground on the project, check with HUD on whether your release of funds is still valid. And then finally, when one or more of the conditions described in 58.47 exists, and those conditions would be either a change in the scope of the project or change in environmental conditions, then the recipient or tribe must reevaluate the completed environmental review. We're going to be talking about reevaluation in the last webinar in this series, so stay tuned for that. I'm not going to talk about reevaluation in this webinar. All right, so that was what the text of the regulation says. So how do we think about it, and how do we apply this to our programs and activities? So the regulations talk about functional versus geographic, by type of activity would be functional, or aggregating by all of the activities that are happening in one location, that would be more geographic. You can also think about it, practically speaking, when you're in your offices by, which environmental review form am I using? Which level of review are my activities? And then aggregate your activities that way. So we'll talk about that at length. Your exempt and CENST activities that have the same environmental impact, your CEST activities, and your environmental assessment activities. So we'll have examples of all of those. And then we'll go over when you're aggregating activities or components because they are logical components of a larger project. And that gets at combining HUD funding and non-HUD funding. So even if you have a project with multiple funding sources, some of it HUD and some of it not, the whole project should be aggregated. Okay, so starting off with functional aggregation, again, from the regulations, this is when one type of activity occurs in multiple locations. You have single-family rehab, individual actions, which means you can have acquisition, new construction, demolition, disposition, or even refinance of scattered site housing. And then the images below on the slide, you can see units marked across the community. So even though the units aren't right next to each other, or even in the same neighborhood, or even in the same town, you can aggregate them into a single review because you're doing the same thing to all of those homes. And then geographic aggregation, that's when a mix of dissimilar but related activities are concentrated in a fairly specific project area. So that was the text from the regulations. Examples would be housing and infrastructure, or acquisition and conversion to a new use. So we'll talk about those more throughout the presentation. Practically speaking, aggregating by level of review. So putting your exempt and categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5 activities together, because that would minimize the number of reviews you'd have to do for those activities, which all have the same environmental impact. Aggregating your categorically excluded subject to 58.5 activities, including your single-family rehab, individual action, scattered sites, or on 4 or fewer units in one location, mixing individual actions and rehab on scattered sites, or 4 or fewer units in one location, and then your environmental assessments. So when you have more than 4 units that you're doing an individual action on, when you're having your housing development and infrastructure, or when you have development activities that might be related that are on a single parcel of land. So we'll start from the easy stuff, the basics, and work our way to more advanced cases. Exempt activities. Rule of thumb, you are allowed to put together most activities that are exempt in one environmental review. All exempt activities have the same potential for environmental impact, and the compliance determination language for the environmental topics listed in the 58.6 checklist for exempt activities, all of it is going to be the same. And then in your review, you set the time frame for 5 years. Here is a listing of the exempt activities under HUD regulations at 5834A. And so what you would want to do is look at the activities carried out by your program, such as through your Indian Housing Plan, and match your activities to the activities listed in the regulations. You'll want to make a note of the citation number, and on this slide, the citation numbers are the numbers that are after each of these activities. So for example, the most common activities that you might see in a tribal housing program would be planning and management activities, so salary, staff, in-house things, your public services or public programming, such as crime prevention, job fairs, childcare, counseling, energy conservation, recreational needs. So your after-school activities for students, that's number 4. Inspections and testing for hazards and defects. Purchase of tools or purchase of insurance. And technical assistance and training. So all of those have the same level of potential environmental impact. That is to say, basically no environmental impact. So you can just group them all into one environmental review for exempt activities. A note about temporary or permanent improvements that do not alter environmental conditions and are limited to activities that control or arrest the effects from disasters or imminent threats to public safety. That falls under a separate category, and we'll be talking about that at length in a future webinar on emergency repairs. So stay tuned for that. That'll be happening later on this fall. Do not aggregate your emergency repairs or temporary or permanent improvements for emergency or disasters. Do not aggregate that with other activities. Okay, so here is an example of the exempt form. For all of these examples, I'm really just going to pull out a couple of items from the project information. So the project name, project location, description, and level of review determination. There is a bunch of other items on the form. I'm not going to go over that because we already talked about those in the previous webinar. So for exempt activities, the project name could be the Tribal Housing Authority's exempt activities for the next 5 fiscal years. Project location, these are all in-house items, so we'll just use the housing office's address. And then the description would basically be a paragraph listing all of the citations that we matched earlier, and maybe you describe it for whatever your programs are specifically. So in this case, this review covers exempt activities and programs funded by the Indian Housing Block Grant for the tribally designated housing entity from fiscal year 2023 through 2027, including salaries, planning, management, and admin, training and technical assistance, purchase of insurance and tools, inspections, including lead-based paint and radon test kits, etc., public services offered by the housing program, including after-school activities, recreational activities for youth, job career counseling, and weatherization assistance programs. In this example for weatherization, I include more information talking about weather stripping and plastic window film, just to make clear that we're not paying for new windows or new doors and that there's nothing really physical that's going to be changed about the building. We're just adding weather stripping and plastic film that can be easily removed. And then under level of review determination, I check exempt, and the citations would be number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. Where do I get those citations from? Again, that was from the regulations. So on this page, you see all the highlighted items that are in yellow. The numbers are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. So that's how I got that. So you just list all of those citations. You can also list the allocated budget for each of those line items in the project description if you want, so that it's clear how much money you intend to put towards each of those line items separately. Or you could also refer to the Indian Housing Plan. So maybe include a line here that says refer to Indian Housing Plan for exact breakdown, and then include a copy of it with your review. That way, when HUD comes in to monitor and says, how much money is going towards each of those, then you have something to show them. And then for funding, so grant amount, HUD program, funding amount, so aggregate, so altogether, those exempt activities, maybe you say this amount. Note that we don't want to have you write the full grant amount. Don't say what your full Indian Housing Block Grant amount is. We just want to know how much of that grant is going towards these exempt activities. And then you can say that per year or how much over 5 years. And again, as we mentioned in the previous webinar, this number doesn't need to be exact. You can go high, you can go low, as long as you have the same number of zeros, plus or minus. This is just an estimate. And then for the laws and authorities under 58.6, which the topics are airport hazards, coastal barrier resources, and flood insurance. The project does not involve the sale or acquisition of developed property or rehab or new construction, so airport hazards is not triggered. The activities do not include financial assistance involving physical impacts or structures. Also, and I do recommend that you include this just to cover your bases, look up the maps for your community for the coastal barrier resources. Most of you will be in states or communities that don't have any, so just include that, write that, and then you don't need to ever look that up again. And then finally, for flood insurance, this project does not involve mortgage insurance, refinance, acquisition, repairs, rehab, or construction of a structure, so flood insurance requirements are not triggered. And so for airport hazards and flood insurance, you don't need to look at a map because the activities that you listed in your project description are not the types of activities that would trigger these requirements. Okay, Sandy, I think there are a couple of questions or comments that came in.
Yes, we had two questions. First question was why 5 years as far as how to aggregate your environmental review? So I don't know, you want to address that question first?
Sure, 5 years. You could do it every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years if you wanted. You can always go lower. For some folks, it's just easier to keep track of the planning process. If you just do the reviews every year, then you just have a way of knowing, oh, okay, we're planning for an Indian housing plan right now. Let's just build in the environmental review in the process. If you do it for 5 years, then that's less work overall. Why not more than 5 years? That's because informally or unofficially, HUD views environmental reviews as good for up to 5 years. Danielle or Kathy, do you have any comments about the 5-year threshold or 5-year timeline?
This is Danielle. Yeah, it is something that we'll be working with the Office of Environment and Energy to clarify with the reevaluation webinar coming up in the fall. But we use that rule of thumb because it comes from CEQ's regulations about how long an environmental impact statement is. So that's why it's there, and we'll be relooking at it for HUD's environmental review purposes.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. So recap of that, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, they have regulations on how long an environmental impact statement is good for, and those are the largest types of environmental reviews or the most complex projects. So that's where HUD is basing the 5 years off of. And then Sandy, there was a second question.
Yes, there was a question having to do with, on one of the slides you mentioned the determination language for the environmental factors 58.6 is the same for both exempt and categorically excluded, not subject to, and they wanted to know, could you share that language?
Okay.
I think by covering your, this slide, that may have answered their question, but that was one of the questions.
Okay, great. So use the language on the slide, except for coastal barrier resource units. Make sure that you check your own state and your own community for where those units are, or, if you don't have a coast, then. Okay, and then someone says they are still leaving the slide ups and copying this. So don't change the slide yet. Yeah, so again, we're going to go through this webinar from easy to hard, so easy to complex. So easy, exempt. Put all your exempt activities together in one review. Use the language on this slide, except for the middle box, which state you're in. And then we're going to revisit this language when we do some of our CADEX not subject to or CENST activities. Not all CENST activities can use the slide, but we can, or can use this language, but there are some activities that we can do. So we'll go over that in the next couple of slides. And then there were a couple of other questions that just came in.
Yes, somebody wanted to know, will the training be available to view after today?
Yes, we're still working on the exact logistics, but in about a month or so, the materials should be posted online at either the HUD Exchange website or the HUD COTAC website, or there'll be links to them from there. And hopefully we'll also send out a notice to everyone who is registered for these webinars. Okay.
And then there was, yeah, there was one more question about under the section dealing with project repair and arrest the effects of a disaster or imminent threat. Does this include replacing a roof that was damaged or in need of replacement? So
replacing a roof in general, just hearing that, I would say that does not include that. Replacing a roof is a CADX not subject to activity. We will be going over emergency repairs and what that means in light of the environmental review. We'll be talking more about that and having specific examples in a later webinar in October. So we're not equipped to deal with those problems or those questions right now. But thank you for asking that. Goes to show that these are very important questions that do impact your activities. Okay, so moving on, now that you have some introduction to aggregating your exempt activities, now we're going to move on to the CADX not subject to 58.5 activities. And there are different types of, there are different ways that you would aggregate them. So the first one is maintenance. You can aggregate by all your units. If you have 30 units in your housing stock, you can do one review for maintenance on all 30 units instead of doing them one by one. Make sure that you do not aggregate maintenance with your other CENST activities though, because maintenance does involve a physical structure. And then 5835B1 and 2, those are tenant-based rental assistance and supportive services. Those can be aggregated under your rental assistance programs. They have no environmental impact and don't trigger the 58.6 compliance. And then soft costs and non-maintenance operating costs can also be added as CENST activities that you would aggregate together with reviews in terms of activities that don't have impacts. And again, you set the reviews for 5 years. Here's an example of aggregating for maintenance. Project name, maintenance activities on the rental units. If you have a lot of units, maybe you talk about the location or the neighborhood or the town, municipality, or however you group them geographically. I like having the fiscal years next to it or the date next to it, so I know, okay, so basically I can just look at the project name and see when the review is good for. Project location, here I've got 20 rental units with the following addresses, and I've listed all 20 of them. And then for the description, the review covers maintenance activities as defined in HUD's notice, guidance on categorizing an activity as maintenance on the Housing Authority's 20 rental units for a 5-year period. This review does not cover any rehab activities as defined in that same notice. And then the level of review determination would be categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5, and the citation is 5835B3, operating costs, including maintenance. So again, you put all of your units together into one review. For the 58.6 checklist, here, because you do have actual addresses that you're going to be performing physical work on, you do need to check maps. So for airport hazards, you should check that none of the units are within 15,000 feet of a military airport or 2,500 feet of a civilian airport. In this example, the closest airport is 3 miles away. You see a map and you show the map, therefore we're in compliance. And of course, if any of your units are closer than that, you just need to show that the units are not within the airport clear zones. Coastal barrier resources, show if there are any barrier resources in your community or in your state. And then flood insurance, make sure that you look up each unit and whether each unit is in a floodplain. So include the FEMA map panel number and effective date. Sometimes you can have one map that covers all of the units, and sometimes you might need multiple maps. So here's an example of what that supporting documentation might look like. So for the airport hazards, I mark the closest unit, and then I also mark the location of the other units. And you can see that the airport is at least 3 miles away from all of the units. And then I think we just had a question come in about the airports.
Yeah, there was a question prior to that, again, about imminent threats as well. I know you're going to be discussing that in more detail in another webinar, but I just figured I'd throw this out there that the question was, do you do an exempt, categorically excluded, not subject to, and categorically excluded subject to review for imminent threat types of projects? And so thought you just might want to address that real quick.
Okay.
As well.
It really depends on what you mean by imminent threats and what you're physically doing to address those threats. So and this gets at having a good project description and being very clear about your scope of work and what's happening with your project. So it really depends on what you're physically doing in terms of which form you would use for the environmental review. And then I think we had a question come in.
Okay, yeah, do you need to generate an aerial map for the runway for each home if they are located on scattered sites?
For scattered sites, you first want to see if they are within those threshold distances. So those threshold distances are 15,000 feet of a military airport, which is about a little bit less than 3 miles, or 2,500 feet of a civilian airport, and that's about half a mile. So as you can see in this map, none of the units are within those threshold distances, so you don't need a clear zone map. But if you did have, and so the scattered sites, if in this example, conveniently, all the units are located to the southwest of the airport, but let's say you had some units that were to the north or to the northwest, you would want to show where those units were and just measure those distances from the airports and just make sure that you clearly demonstrate that all of the units are not near the airport. And then if any of them are near the airport, just show that the runway clear zones don't overlap with the project. Okay, hope that was clear. And then here's an example for flood insurance. In this example, all 10 units that I've circled in yellow and marked and numbered, all of them fall on one flood map, so I can just show one flood map and have the units on that map. That's very convenient. That's great. One map, perfect. More realistically, your scattered site houses aren't going to be on the same portion of the same map. So what I usually do would be to have a chart listing the addresses, and then for each address, show a map of where that home is or where that unit is and where it is in relation to the flood map, including the map panel number and the effective date. Were there some other comments and questions that came in just now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, there was a couple of questions. One question was looking for the recording of the forms training that we had. And I think that's been posted. It's not up yet? Okay. I wasn't sure if that was up there yet. So I guess whenever it is, we'll let everybody know. And then there were some comments about Somebody said they usually generate a map per unit whenever they do a CADX or an EA for a project for clearance purposes. More of a comment than a question. And then is there a way to remind preparers of environmental documents that if they are an imminent threat and the HUD 2012 memo should be used in the review and the notice? So I think one of the things that we keep getting questions about imminent threats. And I know
Shouldn't have mentioned it.
people don't seem to want to wait for the next session. So, you know, I know there's a lot of confusion on that, but there is a form that HUD has developed now that you can use to document compliance when it's an imminent threat, because it's a little unusual. It's not exactly the same as other exempt activities. So I don't know if you want to address that now, or again, you know, let folks know you're going to be doing that in another session.
Yeah, we'll do that in a later session.
Okay.
Takes a few months to think it through and prepare all.
And then there was a question you said, yeah. Question, you said 30 units. Can it be more than that?
Yeah, 30 units was just, I'm just spitting out numbers, having hypothetical examples. You can include as many units as you want. I know some folks manage hundreds of units. A couple of tribes even have thousands of units. In that case, you could put them all in one review. Just make sure the flood maps and the airport maps cover all, you know, 500 or 1,000 units. Another way of doing it that might be more manageable is to break the reviews up into smaller bite-sized pieces of 20 to 80 units a piece, according to you know, the village, neighborhood, district, chapter, town, city, municipality, zip code, county, or state. Every tribe is different. Every community looks different. Your rental units or the units that you manage are going to look different depending on the tribe. So there is no limit to the number of units that you can aggregate into one review. It's just what's manageable on your end. I think a couple of comments just came in.
Okay, and there was yeah, can you use this chart style for airport space also? I'm not exactly sure what that might be referring to.
No, that's a great comment or question. Exactly. So the earlier example I had here of the airport clear zone, I conveniently had all the units located to the southeast, but in reality, in a real life situation, maybe the units would be scattered all around the airport or in different towns that are different distances from the airport. So in that case, you could just use a chart, just like I did for flood insurance, and just show the address and then a map of where that project is in relation to the airport. So yeah, that's perfect.
And a question on, can we send the link on how to find the flood maps and airport, etc.? So that might be a link to HUD Exchange, because I think there might be two different types of links they're looking for there.
Yeah, or maybe send a link to NEPA Cest and the FEMA Map Service Center or National Flood Hazard Layer.
Right.
Yeah, so if one of you ladies would like to do that in the next couple of minutes, I will move on.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that was maintenance. Moving on, simpler topic, rental assistance. Rental assistance for the next 5 years. Project location would be the service area for the program, and the description would be something along the lines of, this review will cover the programs or the Housing Authority's rental assistance programs, including rental payments and utility payments for eligible tribal members, short-term as well as regular, room and board per semester for eligible college students, lodging assistance for folks who need to quarantine or socially distance due to the pandemic, and daycare payments for eligible tribal members. So this is just an example. Maybe with your rental assistance programs, maybe you also include security deposits or other types of assistance related to housing or utilities that are basically payments or vouchers to landlords and utility companies. So describe it whatever makes sense for your program. And then for level of review determination, you're doing tenant-based rental assistance and supportive services, so CENST at 5835B 1 and 2. So that one's pretty easy. The 58.6 laws and authorities, basically copy and paste from your exempt review. Okay, so moving on in level of difficulty or complexity. So here is a listing of the activities that are CENST. There are 7 of them in the HUD regulations. The first 2 we just talked about as rental assistance programs. We talked about maintenance earlier. So what's left? We have other operating costs that are not maintenance, that don't have physical impacts. You have economic development activities that tribal programs generally don't do in terms of tribes, or HUD usually doesn't fund this for tribes, so I'm going to ignore that one. The next one is down payment assistance, closing costs for home buyers. That one is similar to maintenance in that it involves financial assistance to actual structures, which requires that you check the 58, which requires that you check maps for the 58.6 checklist. So don't aggregate maintenance and down payment assistance with the other items in yellow. And then affordable housing pre-development costs, those are going to be your soft costs for construction project. The last one, supplemental assistance, we talked about that in last month's webinar on basic environmental review forms. So supplemental assistance, that's when you have a separate grant or a new funding source for a project that you already reviewed. So that's just documenting what the grant number is and what project and how much money is going towards it. So that's sort of like a one-off thing. You do not aggregate supplemental assistance with your other activities. So the list of 7 activities, you can aggregate 3 or 3.5 of those into one review. What does that look like? So project name, something like CENST activities with no physical impacts. Project location could be the service area and the address of the housing office, because you're sort of mixing and matching. Project description, listing your CENST activities and programs. So the first bullet is basically the same as the rental assistance programs that we just did. Second bullet is your operating costs, not including maintenance. And the third bullet is the affordable housing pre-development soft costs. So basically all of the yellow items that we highlighted here, we're putting it into the project description. And then the level of review determination would be CENST, and then number 1, 2, 3, and 6. So you can put all your CENST, or you can put half of your CENST activities together. And then once you get a good handle on how to do that, then the next level of doing this, let's see, there was another airport map question that just came in.
For airports, I find Google Maps helpful to find and measure distance to and from airports.
Okay.
Not necessarily a question, but a comment.
Okay, maybe someone wrote to me directly. Let's see. Okay. Yeah,
there was a question on when we perform maintenance activities on using the form. Do we need to note anywhere during the 5 years, or does the form cover all work for 5 years?
For maintenance?
Mm-hmm. I think she was referring to, I guess there is a section on there where in the project description, you'd want to be clear of the time period you're covering. It wouldn't automatically, I guess you could say if it started at a particular year, it would be good for 5 years, but it's probably better to make sure you list the fiscal year like you're showing
Yeah.
here
Yeah, like
of the period that it covers.
right. If you already have a review done for maintenance and you didn't include the time frame, but basically from the date it was signed, I'd say it's probably good for 5 years and you don't need to change it. I wouldn't worry about changing it, but moving on into the future, moving forward, just to have the date there so that you know, so that everyone is clear about what's going on and when this is good for, just makes the communication clearer.
And there was another question, a fairly long question about, can you use a map with a radius starting from the APZ to show what units that might be within 2,500 feet of the accident potential zone or within 15,000 feet of the runway of a military airfield?
Yeah, that works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so moving on, now that we've done exempt and then Cest activities, next trick we're going to do is put them all together. So you can actually put your exempt and Cest activities together on the same review. As we learned in the last webinar, exempt and Cest activities are recorded on the same form. So basically, you don't need, you can just reduce the number of reviews you do by just putting them together, marking them all off as activities that have no physical impact, and selecting both exempt and Cest under the level of review. And again, do not include imminent threats or emergency repairs, CESTs that convert to exempt, maintenance of rental units, down payment assistance, or supplemental assistance into this aggregated review, because those are activities that require separate reviews on their own. Okay, so what does that look like? Project name, put your exempt and Cest activities together. Description of the proposed project. The first bullet is a listing of your exempt activities. Second bullet was the rental assistance program. Third bullet, operating costs, not including maintenance. And then the last one, soft costs. So basically put both of those together and now you have one review that covers all of them. And the level of review determination, you check both boxes and you list all of the applicable citation numbers. Okay, so now we'll move on to aggregating CEST reviews, which will be more of the meat of the project. So you want to group together projects that involve the same activity. For example, so this would be functional aggregation. If you're doing single-family rehab on 50 low-rent units, you do one review covering all 50 low-rent units. If you're doing new construction of 5 scattered site homes, you do one review covering all 5 homes. Or if you're doing demolition and reconstruction of 4 units, then you do one review on all 4 units. Same with disposition of 3 units, do one review covering all of those units. Now, if those units are in different states or different counties, or if you're doing them 2 years apart, or you don't know where they are, there are a lot of caveats where you might not be able to aggregate all of those units into one review, but whatever makes sense, if they are occurring in different states, and you're doing, 100 units or 500 units, maybe you change that around, but this is sort of the rule of thumb. You want to do fewer reviews for more units. So what does that look like? This is basically the same thing as maintenance, except that you have a longer 58.5 checklist to fill out. So rehab of your rental units, 50 units as listed below. You've got the addresses, maybe even the legal addresses or coordinates, and the year built. Description, for example, this review covers rehab and modernization of 50 single-family dwellings Proposed project includes work to address deferred maintenance, modernization, and other improvements to meet state and local code requirements and minimum property standards, and any interior or exterior rehab activities, including but not limited to roof replacement, interior, exterior walls, window replacement, HVAC, plumbing, electrical work, and so on over the next 5 years. Work will be limited to the structure, so no ground disturbance is expected. So try to include what you think about as rehab into this description. Of course, not all 50 units will get everything, or actually probably none of them will get all of those. You know, unit 1 might get a new roof, unit 4 might get a new furnace, more new electrical stuff. So this is not saying that you're going to do all of those items on all of those homes, but you want to include kind of this is the possibilities of what we're going to do. You don't have to get into the weeds about you know, what type of window or what type of wood you're using, but you do want to give the reader or the HUD person or the person you're consulting with, or sorry, that person that you're consulting on the project with, you want to give them enough information to know what parts of the home or the property will be touched by the work that you're doing. Ground disturbance, very important. Any paint or insulation is important for lead-based paint and asbestos for older homes. And then styles and windows and things like that could be important if you're working on a potentially historic property. So this is kind of what those descriptions would look like, but of course you would tailor it depending on your local requirements and how old the homes are. Okay, so that was functional aggregation. You can also geographically aggregate on homes if you're doing multiple things on those homes. For example, if you're rehabbing your low rent units, but you're also maintaining them, you don't need to do 2 reviews, one on rehab and one on maintenance. You could just do 1 review covering both. And then it doesn't matter what the scope of work is in terms of maintenance versus rehab, because if you do one for rehab, you'll just cover everything. Another example that I've been coming across a lot, acquisition for rehab and maintenance. Maybe you're buying new properties to add to your housing stock, or maybe you're trying to add homes to your lease purchase program. You would do 1 review covering acquisition, rehab, and maintenance. And instead of doing separate reviews, one on acquisition and then another one on future rehab. And if you're doing this for multiple units, you can group them into 1 review depending on timing. So functional and geographic aggregation, we're doing multiple things to 1 unit on multiple units. If you don't know the addresses up front, then you can also use a tiered review. We won't have a webinar on this, that we don't have one planned, but we are going to have a case study that will be written out and available on the HUD website in the future. So stay tuned on more information on tiered reviews. Okay, so aggregating rehab and maintenance. You could add maintenance to the project name, but that's really optional. Basically, not very different from the rehab review at all, except that I added a sentence at the bottom. This review also covers any maintenance and admin costs associated with operating these units. If you didn't have that and you did maintenance on a project and you only had the review on rehab, it's not the end of the world. It's not a big deal, but this is just communicating more explicitly that you're also probably going to be doing maintenance on those units. Okay, and then here's some examples of aggregating multiple actions on the same units. So a possible project name could be acquisition, rehab, and maintenance of 3 single-family homes, and then I list the addresses. Another option, you could say acquisition of 3 homes for the Housing Authority's lease purchase program. And then I would have the addresses listed in the project location. For the description of the proposed project, no, the Housing Authority proposes to purchase 3 single-family homes for its lease-to-own program, where an eligible applicant can then lease the unit for eventual home ownership. In addition to acquisition, this review covers any necessary maintenance and rehab activities over the next 5 years. So then you have one review covering acquisition, rehab, and maintenance. Okay, so let's take a breather. Knowledge check. If you manage 80 rental units in one community and your current Indian housing plan allocates funding to modernize or rehab approximately 15 homes per year and maintain 80 units a year, and they're the same 80 units. What is the most efficient way of organizing the environmental reviews? And I'll let you read that over. There should be a poll question that you can click the answer to on the right, and it'll give you a minute to come up with some answers. Do you do one review for maintenance and one review for rehab for the next year? Do you combine maintenance and rehab into one review for the next year? Do you combine maintenance and rehab into one review for the next 5 years? Or do you do one review for maintenance and separate reviews for rehab as your inspector tells you which houses need major repairs? Okay, and most of you got this right, so that's great. The best answer, or the most efficient way, is C. You combine maintenance and rehab into one review covering the next 5 years. The other answers aren't wrong. They are all possible ways of organizing reviews, but C is the one that's going to be the least amount of work for you. Okay, now we're going to move on to more complex topics involving things beyond rehab, new construction or individual actions. So for example, for individual action, some projects require an environmental assessment because they do not meet the individual action or scattered sites threshold for a CEST project. For example, maybe you have more than 4 units within 2,000 feet of each other, and so you have to think about functional and geographic aggregation. For example, demolition and reconstruction of more than 4 units in one area, acquisition of more than 4 units in one area, or new construction of more than 4 units in one area. And when I mean one area, what that means is, the 5th or more unit has to be in order to be scattered site housing, the 5th unit has to be more than 2,000 feet away. But if you have more than 4 units within 2,000 feet of each other, you would have to do an EA, as we saw in the previous webinar. Okay, so just to quickly apply that with another knowledge check, you plan to demolish and reconstruct 18 poorly insulated slab-on-grade units in a subdivision pictured on the right-hand side. How do you do the environmental review? Do you separate the project into 5 CEST reviews of 3 to 4 units each? Call the project rehab and do a CEST review on all 18 units? Call the project an individual action, so demolition plus reconstruction, and do a CEST review on all 18 units? Or do you do an EA on all 18 units? Okay, so 2 answers got the most traction. About a third of you said call the project in individual action and do a CEST review on all 18 units, and 2/3 of you said do an EA on all 18 units. The correct answer is D. Do an EA on all 18 units. Demolition reconstruction is an individual action, but you have more than 4 units within 2,000 feet of each other, so you can't do a CEST. You have to do an EA. There is only one right answer here, and that is do an EA. And then real quickly, some questions that came in. Do you need to write in a project description for all funding with activities or put in funding in the grant number? So with the funding amount, you would probably, you can separate by line item, or you could refer to your Indian housing plan. Just, you know, if HUD comes in and asks you, so how much money are you putting towards these aggregated projects, then you would have some way to refer them to information saying that, okay, we're putting 10,000 into salaries, 20,000 into public programs, 30,000 into rental assistance, things like that. And then there was another question, what if over the 5 years some units are conveyed? Shouldn't change or amend the review, should it? Conveying the units is fine. Yeah, you don't need to update that. Is the EA because of the number of units? Yes, because you have 18 units that are within 2,000 feet of each other. You would have to do an EA. You cannot do the CEST. Okay, moving right along. And then there's also aggregating project components for an environmental assessment, such as when you have phased development of housing in one area. So phase 1 plus phase 2, regardless of funding sources. In this realistic example, you have a plot of land that's surrounded by roads, and it can fit 10 units comfortably. Right now, you have funding to do 5 homes, and you eventually want to plan 10 homes total, but you just don't know where the funding is. You should still do the environmental assessment for all 10 homes, even if you don't have that funding secured. And then you might have one project site or property with multiple components, such as acquisition and housing and infrastructure, or adjacent related developments if they're roughly in the same time frame. And we'll go over examples in a moment. Okay, so quickly applying that knowledge, you had an EA for a master plan covering 4 potential new subdivisions completed in 2019. The first subdivision was completed in 2020, and you plan to build subdivision 2 in 2022. Do you need a new environmental assessment? Okay, and actually most of you got this one right. You do not need to do, let's see. You do not need to do a new environmental assessment because the original review aggregated all of the subdivisions, covering subdivision 2 and all the other ones. If you have new funding sources, you would still have to do a CENST review for supplemental assistance to record that new source of grant funds. If there are changes to the project scope or environmental conditions since the time that you completed the original review, you would reevaluate the EA. And then a related question, how do you document the lack of funding? In the funding screen, there is, you talk about how much HUD funding is going into the project and then the estimated total project costs. So if the estimated total project cost is higher than the amount of HUD funding that was available, then that implies that you have other funding sources or unidentified funding sources. So don't worry so much about the lack of funding. When you do secure that funding, you would do that CENST review for supplemental assistance. And then there's another question on the previous example. Do you do rehab demo 18 units in multi-phase, multi-year, or still best way to do an EA? If you're planning to demolish all 18 units because they're all constructed poorly, and even if you don't have the funding now, or if you want to do it in phases, I would still say put that into an EA, just so that you have the full scope of that work covered and the full environmental impacts of that covered. If you have specific examples with different nuances, I suggest contacting your HUD representatives and asking for clarity on your specific case. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about infrastructure considerations. So when you have infrastructure that needs to be expanded for the project, include that in the project description and in the environmental analysis. Cover the whole footprint. And so new utility connections for sewer, water, and power, communications infrastructure, roads, things like that. For example, if you have a plot of land, property boundaries there, and you want to build some houses and you decide that, 4 units roughly there would be really nice, you would still have to look at the full property boundaries to assess the suitability for housing for that whole area. And then you would know whether, maybe there's a wetland to the eastern side of that property that might not be suitable for housing. So you want to analyze the entire property. And then this is pretty rural, it's like farm country in South Dakota. So, you're probably going to have to build in some infrastructure and extend from existing hookups. So the footprint of your work is actually going to be much further than your property boundaries. So make sure that when you're doing your environmental analysis, all your maps should cover the full project footprint. This is especially important for farmlands protection, wetlands, floodplains, and endangered species. Okay, so to apply that to this knowledge check, here is a National Wetlands Inventory map. According to this map, does the proposed subdivision, which is in yellow on the top part of the image, does it potentially involve a wetland? Yes or no? And for a lot of you, this might be the first time you've ever looked at this type of map showing this type of wetland. So I'll just point out to you that there is a riverine wetland in blue. So that's probably a stream or a creek right behind the existing housing development. So does this proposed subdivision include or involve a wetland? Okay, this one mixed responses. A bunch of you said yes, and a bunch of you said no. More yeses than nos. This one, we don't have complete information about the project plan, but I would, just based off of the map, I would say yes if the road and infrastructure cross over the riverine wetland to the south. So I can't tell from the proposed subdivision map where the infrastructure is going to go, but logically I'm going to think, well, you're probably connecting it to the existing development, so maybe there's space there to build a road and some hookups and extend, electric power and water and all that. So if that's where that's going to go, then the project will disturb that wetland, and you may need to do an 8-step process for wetland protection. Hope that's clear. There was a question that came in on supplemental assistance. Can you combine rehab and maintenance together if you had a new grant? Short answer, I think yes. I don't see why not. Just make sure that the review that you do your supplemental assistance, like that on that documentation, just make sure you refer to the previous reviews that you are referring to, or that this money is going towards. Okay, so getting more complex by the minute. Aggregation of logical components. So now let's introduce HUD versus non-HUD funding towards one project. Even when HUD funding is only going toward a component of a project, the whole project must be analyzed. And so you want to ask yourself, would the rest of the project be possible without the HUD funded piece? If not, then all of that needs to be aggregated into one project. Or would the HUD component make sense on its own and be possible without the large project? If you did the HUD piece by itself, is this still an actual project, or are you really counting on the other components? This is called but-for logic. But for this component of the project, would the rest of the project be successful? So let's look at this hypothetical example. And again, all of the examples in this presentation are not actual locations or examples that are real. I'm just using realistic examples. So here we see something that looks like maybe a powwow ground on a tribe, at a tribe. And let's say they want to revitalize it and renovate it. They want to spice up the park, add some funding, maybe build an access road to the right, put some utility extensions for water and power, which they can then connect to a new storage facility and bathroom facilities, and kind of really make that a nice park and fairground. Add some bleachers in, solar and lights, a lot of different parts. We're going to make this a really, really nice park, or maybe even a playground somewhere. So let's call this project Park plus Storage Shed and Facilities plus Access Road plus Utilities. The entire project should be evaluated under one EA, even if HUD funding is only going toward one component. So even if the HUD funding is going toward just the bleachers and the fencing, you still have to look at everything that's going on in the park, because all of the activities is what you're doing. Like the greater project is renovating the park, so you want to include everything. Okay, and then next topic, aggregating, acquisition, and rehab. Projects that involve purchase of land or property and new construction on that land or rehab of that property, you should aggregate them together into one review for acquisition plus rehab and new construction. Again, using that but-for logic, but for the eventual plan development, new construction or rehab, would the tribe or the housing authority want to acquire that property? You're only buying that land because you want to build new housing there, or you're only buying that building because you want to convert it into a community center. If you weren't going to convert that to a community center, would you still buy that land? So that's sort of what you want to think about if you're going to put together acquisition plus new construction. Very important, once you consider a project for HUD funding, such as by designating it on your Indian housing plan or submitting a grant application for HUD funding, like a ICDBG grant, then you cannot acquire the property before you complete the environmental review. If you do, that would be a violation of HUD regulations at 5822. Okay, so knowledge check on that example. If the TDHE is acquiring a former hotel with tribal funds and using ICDBG funds to renovate the hotel into a homeless shelter, can the TDHE proceed with the acquisition while the EA is in progress? You want to buy a hotel and change it into a homeless shelter. Can you buy the hotel first using tribal funds and then do the EA later on the conversion into a homeless shelter? Okay, most of you said no, so that is the correct answer. You cannot proceed with acquisition while the EA is still in progress. You are purchasing the building with the purpose of turning it into a homeless shelter. You've already applied for ICDBG funds, so it's going to be a HUD project. Acquisition and renovation must be aggregated into one EA. If the acquisition occurs before the EA has been completed, then you risk losing the HUD money for the renovation. If you bought the land before, if you bought the property before you applied for HUD funding, you know, that would be different. So specific examples, you have to check with your HUD folks on, you know, what's allowed and what isn't. But this is sort of your big picture rule of thumb. Okay, and then a broader example of aggregating logical components. Here is an area with different tribal services or tribal community. And tribe and the Tribal Housing Authority, you know, they're separate entities. They have a wish list for what they want to do with this land. There's a tribal health building and a housing authority. For the tribal health building, let's say they want to renovate the building to expand capacity. And then there's a piece of land right next to that. Maybe they want to eventually build a healing center for the community. And then next to the housing authority office, there's a tract of land that, oh, maybe you want to build a maintenance warehouse to centralize all of your construction operations, you know, the offices, storing vehicles, storing construction materials. So that kind of makes sense for that to be next to the housing authority office. And then below Senior Apartment Drive, where you have all those elder housing units, maybe you want to add a couple more housing units. So most of those bullet points are discrete projects that aren't really related to each other. And so in that case, you don't need to necessarily aggregate those different items. With a couple of exceptions, the tribal health building and the healing center, because they're right next to each other and they're serving the same purpose, you know, they're advancing the same objective, depending on how much, you know, sort of the timing on, okay, well, we definitely need to prioritize renovating the health building, but the healing center, is that something we're going to do, you know, in the next 5 years, or is that something we're going to do, you know, 10 years or 20 years from now? If it's sort of within the same time frame of the next 5 years, then I do recommend probably aggregating those two together. And then the housing units, you wouldn't aggregate that with the maintenance warehouse with the health services, but you would aggregate those 4 buildings, the new construction, together into one review. Okay, a couple more knowledge checks just to make sure everything hits home with you. A tribe is developing a 6-acre property near other tribal services over 3 to 8 years. You completed an EA in 2020 for new construction of 10 elder housing units on 2.5 acres of that property. Housing construction was completed in 2021. And then in 2022, the tribe secured funding to construct a senior center adjacent or next to the housing. Can the tribe proceed with the construction without a new EA? and why. So not just yes or no, but why, yes and why, or no and why. Okay, and then the responses have come in. Most of you got this one right. The answer is no. The review for new housing construction did not include the new construction of the senior center. So, and that's fine. You know, in this case, you could have aggregated. Maybe it made sense to you, maybe you didn't. Neither of them are wrong. It would have been more efficient to do so because they're not necessarily related items. It really depends on a case-by-case basis, but just based on what happened in this case, because you didn't aggregate, you would have to do a new EA for the senior center. Okay, same example, change it up slightly. We have the 6-acre property being developed over 3 to 8 years. An EA was completed in 2020 for new construction of 10 elder units, a senior center, a transit stop for the tribal shuttle, and a traditional healing center on that land. The housing construction was completed in 2021, and in 2022, the tribe secured funding to construct a senior center adjacent to the housing. Can the tribe proceed with the construction without a new EA, and why? Yeah, this example is almost exactly the same as the one before, with the exception that the EA was done differently and they aggregated the activities. Okay, so most everyone got this one right. The answer is D. Under aggregation, a new EA isn't needed. All you need to do is fill out a CENST form for supplemental assistance to record that new source of funding. Okay, and then last topic before we wrap up and do any more questions and answers. Projects with multiple federal agency involvement. When you have multiple federal agencies that are funding different activities, all directed at achieving a common goal, same thing, you want to aggregate the activities into a single environmental review. You want to coordinate with the other agencies on the environmental review and maybe even designate a lead agency so that you're not duplicating work and having multiple environmental reviews for the same project. And assess the impact of all of the project components and not just the HUD-funded component. Here's an example. It's not the most realistic one I can think up, but it's really just to illustrate the point of what to do in these scenarios. So let's say HUD funding is being used to develop some homes, and then further down on that property, USDA rural development funding is being used for housing and infrastructure. Maybe BIA is throwing in money for roads, and then DOT might be connecting that to the highway. Again, not the most realistic thing in the world, but in case you ever had something similar to that, or even if you just had 1 or 2 agencies involved, or 2 or 3 agencies involved, regardless of the funding source, these activities should be evaluated as one project. Okay, so the main points of today's webinar: why do we aggregate? Really important, and make things easier for your jobs, you want to increase the efficiency of environmental reviews by performing fewer environmental reviews covering larger scopes of work. Also important is by doing so, you can evaluate the entire project footprint for the full environmental impacts. Again, if you omit certain parts of certain components of a project and make your scope of work narrower than it really is and fail to aggregate, you might be underestimating the actual environmental impacts of your project. And then what do we aggregate? This is not comprehensive, but a basic summary of the types of activities that we aggregated over the last 90 minutes. Exempt and CENST activities, not maintenance or down payment assistance. Then we put our rehab and maintenance together. We put our acquisition, rehab, and disposition together. Individual actions when you're doing the same thing to multiple homes, whether they're scattered site units or all in one neighborhood or a combination of both. You want to put them together as much as you can. And then more complex logical components of a larger project, such as housing and infrastructure. Okay, so I know we have at least 3 or 4 questions come in since the last time I answered questions. Sandy, what do you have?
Okay, question about what if the tribe buys the property, and this is going back to, I think, the 5822 section where you were talking about, potential violations if you didn't aggregate. But what if the tribe buys the property and puts in roads, sewer, and water, and then the housing authority buys the plots of land to build on the homes, and lets other departments buy plots for their programs? What level would you complete?
Yeah, if you have plots of land with infrastructure, it depends on how many homes you're buying, depends on timing of things, depends on when the HUD funding is going in, and if it's not until later, it depends on how many homes. Whether you're doing scattered sites or whether you're doing more than 4 units on one piece of property. But again, for something this specific, sometimes it's better to contact HUD directly and ask their opinion about your specific example. Danielle, have you run into answering this question before? Or do you have any other insights you could offer?
No, I think you covered it. It depends on information that's not available from this question.
Okay. And then did I say CENST HUD document for that last example? Which example is that? Okay,
It may have been supplemental assistance.
Yeah, supplemental assistance is what you document with the CENST. Otherwise, I don't know which example I did that for. Yeah, for the knowledge check, you would not need a new environmental assessment. You would just do a new CENST. Okay, next question.
And for functional aggregation of single-family maintenance and rehab, if none of the homes exceed the 45-year threshold for historical requirements, do you need to have pictures of the actual homes? And would you have to do a site contamination checklist or form for each home?
For pictures of the actual homes, you could have photos from kind of like remote online programs such as Google Earth or Bing Maps. It depends on what your historic preservation officer wants. If your historic preservation officer doesn't require photos, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. It really depends on other folks when you're doing your reviews, if they accept whether you have photos, that are recent or a couple of years old. You need to have a site contamination form completed for each home. Site contamination form is not required, but it is something that you want to document through a site visit. And how you document that is up to you. Site contamination form or checklist is just a recommended form or a possible form that gives you a lot of things to look for so you can document it easier. It's not a required form, but a site visit is something that is important to document site contamination. Okay.
Okay, we had one more question about a maintenance activity. If they complete a maintenance environmental review record that covers 15 units, and unit 2502 is part of that environmental review, during the next 5 years, if maintenance is performed on that unit, do they need to document that anywhere or anywhere else?
Okay, very good question. For the environmental review, no, you don't need to document that you did maintenance on that unit. You already covered all types of maintenance on all of your units, including that one unit. So if you do end up changing out a doorknob or replacing a window pane, you might have that recorded in your scopes of work or your inspector forms or other documentation, but for environmental review purposes, we don't need to know. Does that answer your question, Shannon? Okay, great. All right, last chance for any other questions. Otherwise, you can always contact your HUD reps for future questions or specific examples. There's also HUD environmental staff. There's a website where you can figure out the contacts for your region. And then HUD environmental staff, or sorry, HUD ONAP staff, there are internal channels you can ask at the Office of Environment and Energy or Danielle to clarify different things if there are circumstances that need more clarification.
There was a couple more questions that came in. One back to the site contamination. Do you know something or know where it is listed that it is not required? I believe they're talking about for a maintenance activity.
That one, I think they might be just talking in general about rehab, documenting site contamination, the site visit for rehab properties or other types of individual or other actions. Where does it say that it is not required? Kathy, as the resident expert in site contamination, is there any HUD policy on when site visits are required and documenting them?
Really, I mean, it's sort of the scope of the project. So for like minor rehab and stuff like that, I mean, I think HUD's OEE's position now is that if you can go on the site visit, that's great. But if you could you can use a satellite, online satellite mapping tool that as long as you can see everything, that the satellite mapping tool shows you a good view of the environment around the single family housing or what you're looking at, then that's acceptable for, minor rehab. But once once you start getting into larger scope and, more things can go wrong on the project site or potential contamination issues, then you should consider a site visit. I always advise that if you're going on a site visit because the program funding requires it, so you have to go because you have to document the physical document the physical condition of the property that you're funding. I'd always say combine that with the contamination site visit and any other site visit you need to do for the environmental review. Just make it more efficient.
Yeah, with I know with acquisition, a lot of times you're going to have an inspector inspect the property, so you can use their photos and their inspection reports to help document the presence or absence of contamination. And with a lot of your programs, if you're just doing single family minor rehab or just acquisition and minor rehab, you know, the risk is not that high. But when you're doing those more complex projects, then, you know, contamination is a higher risk, and you do want to document the possibility or probability of contamination. You want to do your due diligence. So it is, you know, use common sense and manage your risks and liability for your programs.
And your local, the tribe's local contamination, you know, local agencies might understand what's going on in the on tribal land regarding contamination, where it is, if there's any industry going on, that sort of thing. So I would say use your local context too, also.
Yeah, definitely, because your regional folks will understand your communities better than, you know, these national headquarters based websites. So your local ONAP contacts might have a better idea of which databases to use or what resources to use to document this type of possible or likely contamination in your regions and mostly rural areas, you know. Let's see, I think there's a question on how many tribes use heroes. I've seen a handful of tribes on heroes post reviews. I don't know internally how many tribes are using the HUD environmental review online system. Danielle, do you have any idea or numbers, or have you been stalking this or keeping track of this at all?
No, I have not. We do plan on delivering training for heroes, a webinar for tribes in the next couple months. So hopefully you'll hear more about that. We can get more tribes signed up and using it.
Okay. And then current list of environmental HUD environmental trainings, maybe something that starts at the beginning. The HUD Exchange environmental review website has a lot of resources, like a wiser training module that can go over different aspects of environmental reviews, component by component. The ONAP Code Talk website might list some trainings, upcoming trainings. The NAIHC website will list upcoming trainings that they've contracted with HUD for. Danielle, do you have any other suggestions for a comprehensive listing of environmental review trainings for tribes?
Future trainings will be on Code Talk under the training calendar, and existing environmental trainings are available on HUD Exchange, and there's also a link to that in the HUD Code Talk environmental webpage under the training subsection.
Okay, question, are TDHEs required to use heroes? To my knowledge, tribes and tribally designated housing entities are not required to use heroes. If you have a monitoring finding and your HUD representatives are worried about your ability to carry them out, they might suggest that or strongly recommend strongly recommend that you use heroes. But there's overall no program requirement for tribes or tribal housing authorities to use it. And is that in writing anywhere? Danielle, you want to?
No, there's and HEROES is absolutely not mandatory. HUD has been very clear that tribal consultation would be required before it was mandatory. So I don't think there's nothing there's nothing in writing saying that it is not mandatory.
Yeah, it is not mandatory. The HUD Heroes Access website breaks it down by program, and under Office of Native American Programs, they do say that ONAP grantees are not required to use Heroes at this time, or something to that effect. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your active engagement in today's training. I hope it's been useful. Yeah, so feel free to contact your ONAP staff. There will be more trainings throughout the year. There'll be more 3-day trainings, and so stay tuned for all the different opportunities that are going on, and hopefully they'll be listed on the HUD website. And again, this webinar will be available probably in a month or two on the HUD Exchange website and linked to from the Code Talk website.